Yeah, that's the second time I've done that. I spent about 5 minutes. I was trying to interview somebody going, why is my sound not working? And then realized that I hadn't turned the microphone on. So there we
I've
go.
I've done that a lot more than two times, way more than two times. Yeah.
Ah, the joys of non-professionals trying to do podcasts.
Absolutely. I totally love it. I love all of it. I really do. So
It's
fun. I've learned
hilarious.
so much. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it was so nice to meet you at the
Yeah.
Bitcoin conference in Nashville.
Mhm.
Unexpected because I was aware of the climate movie and I actually watched it this morning while I was preparing for our
Oh,
chat.
great.
And I realized I'd actually watched half of it before and then got waylaid. So I was
Oh,
watching it and I was like, this looks really familiar, and
okay.
realized I'd already seen it, but not all of it. And hadn't realized, well, I didn't know who you were at the time. So I didn't know that you were involved. So it was a nice
Okay.
happenstance to meet you at the unconference and get a chance to interview you.
Yeah. I mean, that whole conference was so great for me. I was just bubbling when I got back from it. It just, I learned so much, met so many people. It's really great. I'm still on a high from it right now.
Really?
Yeah, I am. I really am.
That was a long
Yeah.
high.
It's a long one. I'm going to Bitcoin Amsterdam too. All
Are
excited about
you?
that now. Yeah. So that Nashville was the first one I'd been to, but uh,
Are you doing
Amsterdam,
Bitcoin Las Vegas?
I'm already signed up for it. Yes. Yeah. Mhm.
Cool, cool, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm planning on doing that as well. I've booked my hotel, and they very graciously gave Access Tribe a discount code as well. So I've sent that out to everybody who wants to buy a
Oh,
ticket. So
okay.
yeah. Well, thank you for coming on. So to give you some context from my perspective about the climate discussion, I've been quite curious about it for a while. Like initially, I was quite bored by all the sustainability thing. And I used to work at an investment bank in innovation, in corporate innovation. And so we talked about this stuff a lot because we were always looking for startups to join our accelerator program in New York that, had some sustainability or UN sustainability goal kind of applicability. And also because our clients or the asset managers were keen to see what innovations were happening in this space and how they could maybe get involved. And I guess everybody wants to put it on their annual reports that they're hitting all kinds of targets. So I didn't take much of an interest actually in the science itself, probably until I think it was around September 2022. And it just happened that a guy called Jim Shuchuk, who works for Guardrail
Oh,
Mining, had put a post out on LinkedIn just saying that he had read this book by Alex Epstein. And I thought, oh, it might be a good time actually to start delving into this, because by that point I was kind of a year or so into my Bitcoin journey. And obviously, this is a big topic that Bitcoin mining is bad for the environment. And, then there's the counter argument that it's good for carbon capture. And so I thought, oh, it'd be interesting to kind of do a bit of a deep dive in it. So that was really my first proper book that I read. And I was then actually fortunate just a few weeks later to see Alex speak in person. He came over to Canada for an event and I was able to get a ticket, and met him. And he gave a very good talk actually to an audience primarily of oil and gas people. So it was interesting. So that was kind of my introduction to this stuff. And when I started looking into it, I realized that what I thought, what I'd sort of accepted as gospel, shall we say, didn't seem to jive too much with the facts. So, on that note, I would love for you to introduce who you are and just give a bit of background. And then I would love to hear what your journey has been in this, because you've been in this space now for about 15 years. So I'd really like to understand how you got here.
okay. So, yeah, I'm Tom Nelson. I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I would say I was a complete normie until about 2005 or so, where I would just believe whatever anybody said on the news because I thought it had been fact checked, et cetera. And the way I got started into the idea that science isn't always true is that there was this ivory-billed woodpecker rediscovery in 2005 that was announced. There was a great fanfare that they had rediscovered this dramatic big woodpecker that had been extinct for many decades, and they had films of it, and they had a photo of it and recordings. But anyway, the whole thing was a complete crock. I checked into it, even though there was 17 authors and it got so much publicity. But if you checked into it as a normal person and just looked at their evidence, it was just ridiculous. They had a picture of this ivory bill that was 6 pixels, two blacks, two whites, and two blacks. And that we're supposed to say, okay, if you zoom that in and if you got a better look, that was an ivory-billed woodpecker. It was just completely crazy. And I proved that you could take a picture of my office here and you could zoom in enough and you could find ivory bills all over in my office. It was an amazing thing. And So I wrote up that a lot, and actually, the New York Times writer wrote a chapter on the ivory-billed woodpecker about this. His book was called "A Bunch of Amateurs," and it talked about how amateurs can look into all sorts of scientific controversies with their fresh eyes, and they can rip it apart. So it was all very interesting. But at that time, somebody emailed me and said, "You know, I've been following you on this ivory-billed thing, and the global warming thing is very similar. The evidence, again, if you look into it as an ordinary person with fresh eyes, you'll see that there's nothing there. The whole thing is a house of cards." So that is how I got into the whole global warming thing. So then for many years, kind of daily, I've been spending hours looking into all the different, going down all the rabbit holes of cyclones and the polar bears and sea ice, everything. And I've been everywhere. I looked at everything in terms of the data, and there's nothing alarming going on anywhere. There's nothing wrong with the weather at all that hasn't always been also been wrong for the rest of human history. It's just normal weather. Sometimes it's really bad. It's a big world. There's bad stuff going on all the time somewhere in the world. But the whole idea that CO2 is making the weather worse, it's just absolutely not. I would say if anything, it's making the weather slightly better. Slightly warmer times have been better for humans and life on Earth all the time than the cold times. And a little extra CO2 actually is an important factor in helping our crops grow a little bit better. There's a lot of factors, a lot of reasons why the crops are better, but additional CO2 in the air is helping our crops. So this whole idea of fighting CO2, it's like fighting oxygen or like fighting water. It's completely ridiculous. Entirely a scam.
Well, on that note, I think we can end the podcast.
Okay, talk to you next time.
And so what was your background, Tom, that led you into kind of doing this research though? Because you say you were a normie, but what were you actually doing with your life that made you take an interest in this in the first place? Or what were the what was the skill set that you had?
Yeah, I have a master's in electrical engineering, and I actually spent a lot of time working in the computer world as a computer consultant. But I did spend a lot of time in labs just looking at data and taking a scientific approach, looking at data. And that's all you need to do for the ivory bill thing or for even in the global warming thing. You can just check for yourself easily. Ordinary people, you don't need to be a climatologist. You can look at crop yield data for yourself, and you can look at historical records of storms. It's not rocket science at all. And if you just look at it as an ordinary person with an open mind, you don't have to trust anybody. You can look at the data for yourself, and you can figure out that nothing that is going on, there's nothing in the data that's alarming.
Mm. It's interesting though, because I mean, one thing I found quite fascinating about that documentary, what's it called again? The climate, the
Climate,
movie.
yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
Um, it's just the background of how we got here, because it's interesting how there seems to be a coalition of interests in maintaining this kind of climate narrative, that's kind of, what I like to now call the parasitic class, who don't want people having a nice lifestyle, want to maintain a nice distance between the rich and the poor and kind of have that class difference. And particularly being British and seeing how that structure has been very carefully maintained over centuries, it's just interesting that at an economic level that's happening at a global scale as well. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on like the participants in that, because the documentary talked a lot about government funding. So obviously, if the government says, "Hey, there's a climate emergency, we're now going to fund all of this research," and you're reliant on their funding to be able to conduct any research and have a living, you can see how that would incentivize people. But I'm curious, for example, people like Al Gore. I mean, I guess they did touch on that and said that he could get funding, and therefore he started going down this climate thing. But I just personally find it quite astounding that somebody can build their entire lives on something that they then probably know is false, purely just for economic reasons. Like, it seems really kind of exhausting to sustain that narrative on an ongoing basis. Do you think that these people actually believe what they're doing for the most part?
I can't read their minds, but my guess is they do believe it. I think they've convinced themselves that they are saving the world. I think Al gets up in the morning and he thinks, I am saving human civilization from carbon dioxide. I think he's convinced himself. I think people are very, you can delude yourself into thinking all sorts of things. And it's so comfortable to think, or it's so great to think of yourself as a hero. And if he starts to look into the data and know, if he figures out that this thing is all a scam and there's nothing to it, I think that's just way too painful. I think he's got to just continue to believe because it's way too painful to realize he's been wrong all these years. And I think it's not just him. I think there's just enormous numbers of climate scientists and politicians and people walking around in the streets with signs that actually believe that the weather's getting worse and that they're saving our children. And whether they're gluing themselves to the street and stuff, I think they really believe it. It's sad, but they're all wrong. Every one of them is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I saw somebody post something on Twitter, I think it was today or yesterday, and they were sort of screenshotting some of this, saying that I think it was something like 70% of young people have mental health issues because of climate alarmism, if you like, or worry about the climate. And they were sort of saying, at some point this kind of veers into child abuse. And I feel like we've kind of got there. Like, I've been astounded seeing university students just parrot like these lines, and they'll say, because climate change, or, this is because of sustainability. And it really strikes me that people don't question these assumptions. Like, you did touch on, I think, one of the podcasts I was listening to, you were talking about COVID and how, because there was such a mountain of lies around that, people started to wake up. Do you think that that has been the thing that caused the turning point in the narrative changing?
I absolutely do. And I actually heard you make that same point on one of your podcasts. And it's great minds thinking alike because I think that is a huge factor. I've had so many people in real life tell me that independently that I was a normie, they say, until
Mm.
COVID. Then I figured out they're lying to us. And I looked around to find out what else are they lying to us about. And the answer is about everything. I had a lot of people say that online, et cetera. I think that's they really did overplay their hand. The parasitic class really did overplay their hand. And I think it's been a huge factor in waking people up about printing of money and all kinds of other things as well. Um, Let's see. One other point I wanted to make about the young folk before I forget is that there were just some elections in Germany where there were different parties up there, and you could kind of vote on whether you believed in the climate scam or not, depending on which party you voted for. And the Greens did just terrible, especially among young people. The German young people in these elections did not at all go for the Greens. They rejected the Greens and they went for the people who didn't believe in the climate scam. So, uh, I had Ralph Scholhammer on my podcast earlier today. He was saying, don't get too excited about this because this was not all of Germany. It was parts of Germany. But at least in parts of Germany, the kids are not buying the scam anymore. And that makes me happy.
Yeah, that's very reassuring. I mean, I think it's really sad to think when people grow up with a bunch of lies and then they kind of base their whole life on it, and it's kind of a dystopian reductionist kind of lifestyle that they're looking at. So I have to ask a bit of a controversial question then, because I know that you're a few years down your Bitcoin rabbit hole as well. And I'm guessing that you've done a fair bit of research into Bitcoin as it relates to climate. Now, my position on this has always been that I don't believe I mean, I believe the temperature is changing. I just don't think that we're particularly driving it in any meaningful way as humans. But what I always say to people is if you do believe in the climate narrative, then you absolutely must believe that Bitcoin mining is a solution because of the carbon capture, the methane capture, and everything else and what it does. Therefore, if you tell me that you don't support Bitcoin mining, but you tell me that you're a climate, what's it called? Do we call it realist or don't?
Yeah, yeah.
Pseudo realist, then you're either lying or you haven't done your research. But there are Bitcoiners in this space who've based their entire careers on this narrative that Bitcoin fixes the carbon issue and the global warming issue. So do you think that based on your research, they're just completely going down the wrong track?
I do actually. Yeah, I don't like that argument because I think that gives way too much ground to the people who are wrong about the science. So, regardless of Bitcoin or not, we're going to have no measurable effect or no measurable benefit. All this we could spend $50 trillion fighting carbon dioxide. 50 years from now, no measurable benefit or harm. It's just it's a non-issue. So I wish that people defending Bitcoin would not say it's a good thing because it helps prevent bad weather in any way. I don't like that argument.
It helps prevent bad weather. I love it.
I mean, that's what the thing is about. I phrase it that way because that's what it's about. That they're whatever gluing yourself to the streets and not eating cheeseburgers and all that. It's about preventing bad weather in the future, and it's not. It's not going to. No way.
Yeah, I saw a video actually yesterday of somebody who'd glued their hand to a motorway somewhere, a road, and the police were kind of around them with little chisel hammers trying to. And I was just thinking to myself, why are you even bothering? Like, you can leave them there for a few days, and the skin will grow back, and they can just lift their hand off. It's
I saw
just.
that same video. I think, yeah, same one.
I think somebody posted and they said just leave him there, and I was like, kind of. I mean, unless it's like some main highway and there's trucks coming down, then they can't. If it's just a side road, close it off.
Yeah, but these poor people, I mean, I do feel sorry for them. I feel sorry for all the kids in particular that are getting this shoved down their throat and they're saying, why even bother studying because I don't have a future anyway. And other people have childbearing age. Oh, we're not going to have kids because we don't want to bring kids into this horrible future. And it's just evil, it's straight up evil. The people who are pushing this, or it's an evil thing they're doing, even if they think
Yeah.
they're doing the right thing. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I would agree. I think if people are doing it knowingly, certainly, then it's yeah, it's evil. And it's a shame as well because I often think there's a lot of lost productivity. I'm sort of seeing all these like sustainability degrees and qualifications, and I'm like, you're spending time studying something that's effectively useless, and you could be doing something that was worthwhile that would actually, kind of move us forward as a civilization. So it's incredibly sad.
Yeah, I mean, there's like local city councils that have a climate officer or anybody who has climate in their title. I mean, all those people, they could be doing something productive with their lives, and none of them are going to, again, they're not going to prevent any bad weather, or the climate is not going to be any different if they never existed or if they did this job. So it is a huge waste. I agree.
Could you touch a little bit on some of the facts? I don't know how much you can trip these off the top of your head, but I'm guessing that since you've like done this for a while, you might be able to. But just to kind of put this in context for people who might be listening and thinking, "Oh my God, here's a pair of climate deniers." Like, could you list some of the facts and some of the misconceptions that people have?
I mean, I like to approach this as just in pieces, or you can look at one piece at a time. Like one big icon was the polar bears. We're supposed to think more CO2 means less polar bears, but you can just look at that easily as an ordinary person. And it's the other way around. It has been so far that during the global cooling scare in the 70s, there were way less polar bears, way less, maybe 4 times fewer polar bears in the 70s versus now. So they're just doing great. The whole idea, if we emit CO2, that's going to kill off the polar bears. It absolutely is not working that way. But you can go down each and every rabbit hole like this. You can look at global drought. You can look at floods or cyclone activity. It's fun for me because I've been down all the rabbit holes, and you can look at any of them any way you want, and you can't find a signal where if we stop emitting CO2, the weather is going to get better. Um, I don't know if you have any specific questions about any one rabbit hole, but they're all like that. One I like to talk about here in Minnesota, where I'm sitting, is that I just tweeted about this. If you were like 9 days old and you were born in first week of July 1936, you experienced more 100-degree, over 100-degree Fahrenheit days in your first 9 days of life than a person who was 36 now, 36 years of age now. So this whole idea that CO2 is driving higher temperatures in Minnesota, it's not. It was really hot in the 30s. We don't really know why. But every time it's hot here in Minnesota, people in the local papers are saying, even the meteorologists, see, look how hot it is today. You must have caused this. But anyway, the data, if you look at the data, it does not back it up at all. And a wonderful person to follow on Twitter and on YouTube is Tony Heller. Tony Heller does a great job of digging into old newspaper accounts and looking at the data every which way. And he's just ripping apart this scam every single day. And it's wonderful. He's doing great work. Just
Do you
looking at
know?
the data.
Do you know his handle off the top of your head?
I think it's at Tony Climate. I think I can look it up here, but I think on
Tony,
X he's Tony Climate. I think he's
love it.
brilliant. Yeah, he's in the movie too. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What impact do you think this focus on carbon has had on environmentalism in general? Because one of the things that again, I haven't gone and verified this, but looking at wind farms, I'd heard that the offshore wind farms are causing problems for whales where they're trying to use sonar, and then the onshore wind farms similarly are causing problems for large birds that are getting caught in the blades and dying. And that's often seen as this solution, like this sustainability solution, which obviously, I think Alex Epstein calls them unreliables rather than renewables, which I really like his kind of phrasing of it. But like, what evidence is there for that? And I know a lot of it gets suppressed, but what evidence is there that this is causing environmental damage, and what impact in general has this kind of temperature obsession caused for the environment?
Yeah, again, I like to look at those one at a time. Like there's a peer-reviewed study saying that to prevent bad weather, what we should do is hire, I believe it was 200,000 teams of people to go around and cut down large trees and then dig holes and bury the trees because the trees have carbon in them. So if you bury enough trees, you'll sequester a bunch of carbon, and that's going to prevent bad weather. That's an actual peer-reviewed study that we should run off and do this. That's how crazy it is. But a lot of the other stuff is is nearly that crazy. Like the whole ethanol thing. Some people are saying we should be somehow there's a way that if we source our fuel from ethanol from corn in Iowa, that's better, less CO2 than just using hydrocarbon fuel. But I think that there's a lot of unintended consequences of that. Just burning our food for one thing is just totally ridiculous. So the whole idea that that those corn farms are preventing bad weather, totally ridiculous. Another thing that just hit home is I was bird watching here in Minnesota, near kind of in the northern part of Minnesota, and there's all kinds of new solar farms, solar facilities that are there. Some of them are covering good farmland. And the whole idea of a uh, government subsidized solar facilities this far north is crazy. Nobody would put them up if they were just trying to generate energy and it makes sense. It doesn't make any sense. But because of we have to do this, we don't have to think about it. We got to do this to prevent the apocalypse. Then they're putting up these solar facilities where they make no sense. And then I'm sure that if we get a heavy snow this winter, those panels are going to be sitting there under snow. Nobody's going to bother to even wipe them off. So the whole thing is farcical. And some people even argue, and probably in this location, that all the energy you get back from a solar panel put up in this location probably doesn't cover the energy it costs to manufacture and transport and all this other stuff. So it's a net negative even in energy. So it's all about unintended consequences. You probably have read about the wind turbine blades kind of shattering and washing up on the beaches on the East Coast, kind of a toxic waste. Nobody knows how toxic these materials are. Again, I think a lot of those wind facilities that are put up are just going to rust in place, and then the taxpayers are going to have to either going to leave them there, or it's going to cost a lot to take them down because in many places they don't make sense either.
Yeah, that's kind of wild, isn't it? It's really wild. I mean, I just find I mean, there's kind of a lot of memes that go around about this on the internet where they're sort of saying about, farmland versus having solar panels. And I really had like no kind of strong feelings about wind farms, particularly not solar farms. And then I drove through one about a year and a half ago, and it was horrific. It was huge. And you could almost feel like, I don't know, the kind of electrical charge around it. And it was just so dystopian. And this entire kind of section of countryside had been sort of obliterated with these giant things with blades going around. And it's very impressive. It's quite awe-inspiring. But it didn't, like, it wasn't somewhere where you'd want to be, And I was thinking people who had their houses near them, like, yeah, I wouldn't want to live here. This doesn't have a good vibe at all.
There's a guy named Alexander Pohl that's been on my podcast a couple of times. And to me, he is a super interesting guy in that he kind of spent a lot of time in the belly of the beast in banking, maybe for HSBC or some of those uh, some of those big banks. And he thought that thought the wind turbines were saving the planet, et cetera. He ended up being in Sweden, and he saw that they were cutting down virgin forest to make to put up the wind facilities there in the middle of the forest and all the associated roads. They're just cutting up all this virgin territory. And he thought makes no sense. We're trying to save the forest by cutting it down in essence. And so he has been really pushing back against it. He made a movie against it, and he's doing a great job of saying, holding up his hand and saying, why are we doing this? Doesn't make any sense. But so many of these things, they only make sense if you think we're all going to die. Let's not think about it. We got to do all this stuff. Otherwise, we're all going to die. Otherwise, if you step back and look at it soberly, so many of these things make no sense.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would tend to agree with you. I mean, when I worked in the bank, it was like we had a whole sustainability division and the investment banking division, and their whole thing was working on sustainability projects and different types of, financial structures that you could use to issue things that people could buy in order to be sustainable. I mean, it was just like a whole industry in itself. And it's quite sad, really. I'm really curious actually, because given your background as well, like you obviously understand electricity well, I want to delve down a bit of I don't want to call it conspiracy rabbit hole because it's not really a conspiracy rabbit hole, but it's something I'm deeply, deeply curious about. And I don't know if you've taken an interest. So I'd spent a little bit of time reading up about Nikola Tesla a few months ago and reading up about some of his theories about energy and being able to allegedly draw energy out from the atmosphere. And I've noticed that there's a lot of different accounts now on X that are kind of tracking some of this stuff, but from a historical perspective. So they're looking at things like the Egyptian pyramids. They're also flagging up churches and the organs that play in churches and the shapes of the bell towers and saying they think that some of these ancient churches are actually kind of energy sources that can draw energy up from our atmosphere. So one of the things that I thought was very interesting in the climate movie was that they were talking about the temperature changes on Earth being driven by our journey through the bands of the Milky Way, and I thought that was super interesting. And then that some of the effects of heat waves and I think it was cooling, where when the sun was emitting flares, and if they were large enough, it would block some of these rays coming from exploding stars or whatever as we went through the Milky Way, and therefore we would get cooling periods. And I thought that that was quite fascinating. But it kind of, I was thinking about it as well in the context of like the energy field that surrounds the Earth, if you like. And I think they touched on that at the beginning of the movie. Have you delved into that at all and looked into, because I guess my question, I can see why there's a segment of corporations and society for whom it would be extremely unbeneficial if suddenly we could all just harness energy from the some kind of a planetary sphere and just pull it down and use abundant limitless energy. So have you delved into this at all?
I haven't. I'm sorry to say. It sounds like you have delved into it more than I have. But my mind is open to a lot more things now than it was 5 years ago. So I don't know. But I'm glad you enjoyed the near Shaviv stuff and the Svensmark stuff in the movie. Because yeah, those guys are very smart, and I think they make a lot of good points. But one thing about the climate is it's just so incredibly complex. It's not just cosmic rays. There's volcanoes, and there's so many other things that are happening. There's hundreds or thousands of things happening, and we don't understand how they interact. So I don't think even 50 years from now we're going to actually understand Earth's climate. But the whole idea that CO2, it's just the CO2 is the climate control knob, and if it's higher, the Earth is warmer. It's orders of magnitude more complicated than that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. And it's interesting because you look at all these initiatives that they've been doing over the last decades and they've had no impact whatsoever. And then you have to ask yourself, like, even if you think that this is what it is, clearly whatever we're doing is not working. So it's kind of a waste of time, really. You're better off trying to build infrastructure to manage temperature changes. So you've got air conditioning and heating when you need it, and indoor facilities where you can grow vegetables if you need to, and that kind of stuff, than sort of wasting time on CO2. I also found it interesting. I discovered a few months back that they actually pump CO2 into greenhouses to make everything grow quicker. So I thought that was hilarious.
It is, yeah, yeah. Patrick Moore is one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, and I asked him on my podcast what level of CO2 should we have in the atmosphere for optimum life on Earth, and I think he either said 1,200 or 1,500 parts per million, where we're sitting at more like 425 right now. So I think clearly way more CO2 would be good for life on Earth than we have right now, and we are way closer to not having enough than having too much. Because when we get to much below 280 or maybe below 200, then life starts to struggle. So, and if you look at the last 600 million years, we are just way closer to the all-time low than to the all-time high. We've been well above 5,000 ppm. So,
And so if we let's say you take the opposing view then that we're heading for an ice age and you want more CO2, is there something that we as humans can intentionally do to create more CO2, or is it just completely out of our control and out of our hands?
that's a great question, and I don't think it's enough. It doesn't have a big enough of warming effect anyway to make it worthwhile to try to intentionally put more CO2 out there. But I do think all this talk about geoengineering and trying to do stuff to change the planet's temperature, I think we should hold our horses on that because, again, the unintended consequences are probably huge. One other thing I wanted to mention about the wind turbine thing is that multiple people on my podcast have said that the wind turbines themselves actually do have a pretty big effect on the local climate by affecting the winds and the climate or the weather downwind. Can have a fairly big change. It can change rainfall, et cetera, because of course, the wind's blowing there unimpeded. If you put a wind turbine in that place, then it's going to change things. So it's kind of interesting. Again, more unintended consequences. It's all about that.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And is
Yeah.
the unintended consequence usually a positive or a negative or neutral?
That's a good question. I don't know. I guess it depends on what you want. Some people love less rain, and some people really want more rain. There's winners and losers, I guess, with every change in temperature. Actually,
Yeah, fair. It's interesting actually because the whole like chemtrail thing I always thought was just a ridiculous conspiracy theory, and then I started seeing all these videos pop up on like you know X and stuff of news broadcasts where people were just talking about it matter of factly, like, oh yeah, we've seeded the clouds in order to make it rain, etc. And I thought, oh my God, like there is some validity into this, and it did make me wonder as well of how many of the so-called extreme weather events that we're having are actually intentionally created. Do you think that there might be any truth to that?
I guess my experience has been similar to yours. I thought for sure it's just a stupid conspiracy theory, but now again, I'm questioning it, and I've seen the same reports you have, where people are matter of factly saying, "Yep, this is what we did." So there must be some of it happening, but I have no idea how much of it is happening right now. I don't know how to measure that. But I've read mainstream articles about maybe tens of thousands of people in China working in this industry to seed clouds or whatever else. I can send you this after the podcast. I dug into it a little bit because one person on my podcast talked about this quite a bit. So yeah, the more I read about it, the more intrigued I am about what actually is going on out there. Don't know.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I always find it a bit strange with these things that if, I mean, I'm not sure I buy into this notion that it's like we're being sprayed with dangerous chemicals, because my gut reaction is that you can't control the spread of those. So if you're a, let's say, a bad actor and you don't care about the general population, fine, completely get it. But if you start spraying stuff everywhere, there's a good chance that you, your family, or somebody you care about is actually in the line of fire of that. And it just seems a little bit far-fetched to me that that would be the case. Uh,
You would think so. There is this story though that they did this around St. Louis. It seems to be everybody agrees. Yep, we did this around St. Louis. Sorry about that. Probably won't do that again. But they did it around St. Louis. They sprayed whatever
oh,
as a test. I can send you that one too. So my mind is open that if they did it then, why wouldn't they do it again? I don't
what,
know.
a test for what?
I have to look it up. It was they sprayed something on the population of St. Louis. They did. I wish
Oh
I knew
my
the name,
goodness.
but yeah, they did. Yeah.
Wow.
It was
Oh,
decades ago. Yeah.
okay. I take it back then. God, that's nuts. Yeah, and I feel like this well, I mean, Bill Gates always seems to be so it doesn't matter what rabbit hole you go down with this, somehow you always end up at Bill Gates. He's either advocating for more cloud cover, we should block out the sun. And I'm like, I don't think you have any right to block out other people's sun. Or, there's some kind of carbon capture technology that's hugely expensive that needs funding, and he's going to somehow sell this to everybody. And I'm just like, yeah, wherever you go down these rabbit holes, somehow that man always seems to be there.
He is there. I just, while you're talking, in the mid 1950s, it happened where they sprayed a dangerous compound into the already hazy air in predominantly black areas of St. Louis.
Oh my
So
goodness.
they were testing a smoke screen that could shield St. Louis from aerial observation in case the Russians attacked. Anyway,
Why? What was in St. Louis that was needed hiding?
I have to look into it more. Um,
Ah,
the material sprayed was zinc cadmium sulfide, a
wow.
fine fluorescent powder. Yeah, I don't know. I should have known more about it before I brought it up, but it's who knows what else is going on. I just there was a time when I was trusting that they would never do this, but now I am not that trusting.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to the COVID thing, I think a lot of us have had that kind of realization where stuff that it would never have entered our minds that anyone would do this kind of thing. Now we're like, oh my goodness, I think we have to go back through every single thing that we've ever believed and just go back through account. I mean, this is why I was fascinated by this Nikola Tesla stuff, because I was looking at some of the things about the in Egypt. So like the temple of the sorry, the Valley of the Gods, I think, which is where most of the pharaohs are buried. It has all these gorgeous kind of ornate temples and tombs, and they've actually found mummies there. But in the pyramids themselves, they've never found any mummies. There's no kind of gilded decor. There haven't been any kind of meaningful artifacts happening there. And the claim is that it's actually a thing that generates energy. And then you've got pyramids all over the world that are similar in design. And so the theory goes, at least of what some people are kind of proposing, is that this is kind of like an not interplanetary, what do you call it, within the planet, and an earthling kind of energy system that somehow allows you to generate this, or harness this sphere of energy that surrounds the earth and kind of capture it and distribute it as needed. That's the kind of theory that they have. But I got interested in it because I was like, huh, that kind of makes a lot of sense. And then I started seeing stories. You have to go down this rabbit hole and like dig up. This is your next rabbit hole.
Sounds good.
And then the theory was the
Uh,
same thing with the churches, that they had some kind of a function as being kind of energy harnessing things. And you do wonder when you look at like a lot of the churches around the world, it's like, why bother going to, if you want to worship and you want to have a religion, go ahead and have it. But do you really need to build these like unbelievably ornate tomes, and they're everywhere? Like, what purpose were they all serving with their bell towers? So I don't know. It's interesting.
I don't know. We hear explanations, but we don't know for sure how they built the pyramids, right? Are you satisfied that that we know? I don't know.
No, I'm not. And I also like I know, for example, and I mean I've read I forget, I think it was one of Graham Hancock's books. I read it years ago when I was at university, and I remember reading about the base of the pyramids, which has the water damage that could only have happened in in an ice age. Therefore, the pyramids can't be 7,000 years old. They have to be older than the last ice age because they would have had to have been
Uh,
standing. And that made a lot of sense to me, where I just thought it's kind of ridiculous. And then this whole notion of how they're built. I mean, I don't know. There was a I love having a conspiracy rabbit hole chat.
Me too.
there,
Yeah.
there was a story of, I can't remember the guy. I have to find it up and dig it up for you. But there was a guy in Florida who built this thing. It's called something castle. It's still there. It's like a sort of a private residence now slash museum that has all these massive boulders, kind of a bit like what you call it, Stonehenge. It's like a similar concept of these huge boulders that have been lifted and built. And allegedly, the guy built it by using sound in order to move the boulders because he never had any construction equipment there and nobody can figure out how he actually built these things. So you can go and visit this house or this museum, I guess if you want to call it now, in Florida. And I've never been. Um, but I do remember reading some stuff people were saying about, oh, they think that that's how the pyramids might have been built. So not we rolled all these rocks on, logs from thousands of miles away or whatever, and then rolled them up things and managed to build a pyramid in however long it would have taken, which would have been impossible, but more that they were somehow lifted by some other kind of mechanism. I don't know if you've delved into that.
I think I may have just heard of it, but yeah, there's a lot of things I need to check into, including this. Yeah. I do have a totally separate one to bring up when you're ready.
Yeah, go on,
Oh,
do it.
oh, I just had a guy on my podcast who talked about the whole idea of abiotic hydrocarbons on Earth. Not from dinosaurs, not from algae. They came not from life, but from some other source. And that intrigues me because I think he argued persuasively that at least some of the hydrocarbon fuels that we have on Earth were never part of anything living. And there's a moon of Saturn, I believe. I think it's Titan, where everybody agrees. NASA says, yeah, of course, there's a lot of methane up there. There's methane all over, which is a hydrocarbon. And we don't think there was ever life there, but somehow there's a lot of hydrocarbons there. And this guy is arguing that similar processes at some time happened on Earth. And like a lot of the methane that has we've discovered never came from life. It was formed somehow in the same way as on Titan. I think there are a lot of hydrocarbons out there in places where there never was life. So that interests me a lot. I think a lot of it did come from biology and some didn't.
So why would that be revolutionary though? Because it would fly in the face of this thing that oil is, dead dinosaurs that decomposed.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, some people argue it's not really that important. And even this guy, his name is Suresh, he argues that it's not like we can just keep burning it and the earth is going to keep making it. That's not how it works. That he argues that in the deep past in the earth, the hydrocarbons were formed in the atmosphere. And that was at a time maybe after the earth was hit by a large meteor or something. And it's not like we can just live through it if it happens again. He was arguing if we want more abiotic hydrocarbons on earth, we have to wait for this huge disaster to happen and maybe wait millions of years. So it's not like it's going to work to just let it happen again. But he argues persuasively to me that maybe it did happen in the past and not all the hydrocarbons came to us in the way that we think they did.
And
That's what
how
he's arguing.
and how does he argue that you know that the hydrocarbons are not from planet Earth? How would you know that?
I wish I could paraphrase it better. He talked for like 80 minutes. Let's see. I don't have his talking points in front of me. I should. But he argues that a lot of the hydrocarbon reserves that we're finding, they do have biological markers in them, but he thinks they are a mixture of abiotic and biotic hydrocarbons. It's mixed. He says just the evidence that there are some flecks of biotic material in there. That doesn't mean the whole thing came from biology. He thinks that they mixed together and it was very, very complicated. But I don't have it straight in my head how he did it. But he's looked into it for like 40 years. He knows a lot about it. And he says a whole number of other people are, he's got a WhatsApp group that's talking about it. And I've heard there's a book about it. Thomas Gold has a book about it. There are a few people that have broken through a little bit into the mainstream talking about this theory that they told us that all this stuff came from dinosaurs to try to make it look like they are very, very limited in scope, and maybe we can charge more for them or whatever else. But bottom line to me is, for so many of these things, I think the simple explanation that we've been told for decades, we should re-examine it. I don't think we should believe any of it unless we've looked at it for ourselves. So.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting actually, because I think you were talking on a podcast with somebody I was listening to yesterday about Patrick Moore, the co-founder of Greenpeace, and either he or you were saying about how when the movie came out and Patrick Moore was in it, everything that was on the internet about him having been the co-founder of Greenpeace started to get scrubbed, and you can only find it on the Wayback Machine, which kind of brings me nicely back to Bitcoin, actually, in some ways, because I've been thinking about this a lot lately about how like our history is sort of intentionally being erased, and silly things like, everybody was kind of losing their shit the other day because MTV had deleted their archives, and they say, oh, look, they're scrubbing our history. And, maybe that's true. And I know there's a lot of controversy around blockchain bloat, but I do kind of think it's a really great mechanism for us to preserve knowledge in such a way that it can't be erased, in perpetuity, so that people can come back and at least fact check if somebody says, hey, is this true? Is this what was happening in 2024? We can say, well, actually, here are the records. Have you had any thoughts around that?
Just as you said that, it made me think of this SNL, I think it was the Saturday Night Live skit from Peter Sarsgaard. It was back when SARS was a thing. I don't know, whenever that was, 10 or 20 years ago. They did a skit where Peter Sarsgaard was selling these face masks, and they were going to be called SARS guards. And it was a whole skit about how funny and how stupid it was that he had stocked up to sell these these face masks. So that was up briefly, but then around 2020, that one went away. The rest of the skits in that time period were still there, and that one was airbrushed out of history. I thought that was very interesting. I found it on some site that SNL didn't have control of. I was just thinking I should try to find that again. But again, there's this airbrushing. I think the Soviets did that, where they would have old pictures and they would airbrush people out. And definitely with Patrick Moore, that it was inconvenient to have him push back against the scam. So they tried to change the history. There's tons of that actually happening in the climate world. I should mention that. There's a guy named Peter O'Neill over in the UK, just an ordinary person, just like any of us. And what he did is he kept downloading station data, actual temperature data, for the years back in the 1930s. He just, every day he would download it, and then he would compare what he had just downloaded with what he would download the next day. And over, he kept finding that the old data over and over was getting changed. No explanation, just data from the 1930s. It's here one day and it's different the next day. Not just once, but over and over. So again, history is getting changed, and they're not telling us why, but I don't think it's for legitimate reasons. It's amazing. Peter
Yeah,
O'Neill.
that's quite incredible, actually. And Brian
Yeah.
Romele, is it the guy, the AI specialist? He's always sort of talking about that. He does all these dumpster dives and takes all these old videos, and he's storing all this knowledge for the future. And his big thing is like this panic that like our history is being erased. But the thing that it really makes me think about is, we worry about that in the digital age because we're like, oh, somebody can just hit erase and everything is gone. But actually, in the digital age, it means the copies are much more distributed. People will have done pirate copies, they will have saved stuff, it'll be on hard drives all over the place, it might be printed out in PDFs. There's a whole bunch of stuff that gets saved. But it does make me wonder about like older history, even like 150 years ago. To an extent, it was much easier to get rid of. Books were much less widely distributed. So, finding copies and destroying them would be much easier. Editing them, changing stuff would be much easier. And then you start to kind of get into this realm where you're like, well, like how much of what we believe is actually true? I mean, honestly, like of our entire history, known history.
Yeah, I agree. It's a big problem. Again, you make me think of Tony Heller, that he does a good job of looking back at actual old newspaper reports. It's easy for when Peter O'Neill is doing this download, they're changing that database, but it's harder for them to go back and change whatever local newspapers were saying 60 years ago or whatever. So I'm encouraged that some of that stuff is still accessible by us to this day. But I do think it's a really good idea to put important stuff on USB. I put all my podcasts on USB because I don't trust that YouTube's going to leave them up. And yeah, we
Oh,
should
yeah. I mean,
make
YouTube's a
copies.
waste of
Yeah.
space these days. I think the only thing that YouTube has going for it now is like a reasonably good user interface and a network effect where loads of people are using it. But it's interesting to me because I think with all of these services where they start to suppress things, or try and create barriers to entry or like deplatform people, it's kind of silly because their whole business model is predicated on advertising. And if people stop using your platform because they're being deplatformed, or they can't get the data they want, or their friend is no longer accessible because they've been barred, then they stop using that service. And then at some point, it's like you don't have an advertising business anymore. And also, if you're the parasitic class that wants to control the narrative, you can't now control the narrative because nobody's using your service anymore. I mean, we saw when Pavel Durov last week, was it a week
Yes.
before, got arrested in France for those that don't know, the founder of Telegram. I mean, it was crazy for days, like people moving on to Noster. There was just this sea of like people, like waves and waves, just NPub, NPub. I mean, my entire feed on Twitter was NPubs at one point.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, I've just started to post a little bit on Nostr myself, but I have hopes that that can't be erased. I guess even if you want it, can you erase your own posts or can't you? No.
No, and so this is the thing that people criticize about it, and I
Hmm.
think maybe we should look at it as a feature rather than a bug. I
Hmm.
mean, I think the downside of Nostra is that if you lose access to your MPub, you can't recover it. So there is that element of it. Like if you're not custodying it well enough yourself, you know, it gets compromised. You've kind of lost your digital identity on the platform, for want of a better word. But I actually like the fact that you can't delete stuff because it prevents this kind of rewriting of history. And I actually think, I know people are really panicked now about the fact that, oh, you know, you've got this permanent online presence. And if you screw something up when you're young, there it is, it's there for perpetuity. But I also think there's a level of, I guess, us being willing to stand by what we said and recognize that we make mistakes and be able to look back and say, yeah, you know what, I did say that thing and it was wrong, or it was incorrect, or it wasn't kind, or whatever it might be, and kind of own it rather than try and scrub it, you know?
Yeah, was it you that retweeted Jeffrey Tucker tweeted that, I found out that over the years I was absolutely wrong about stuff. I think that was great that I mean, we are wrong about stuff and
A
yeah.
100%. A
Mhm.
100%. I was having this conversation with Michelle Weekly actually when I interviewed her for my podcast. I'm sure you know her. She used to work for
I
like,
listened to that entire podcast. Yeah, I'm a big fan of her. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, she's
Mhm.
great. She's hilarious as well, but she's great. But, you know, we were sort of talking about like the whole thing of how COVID changed us. And, you know, I was a real branch Covidian at the start. I really bought into it. I was like, we're all going to die. You know, I was an early mask adopter. I was making masks before they were available to purchase, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And I think, you know, with quite a lot of embarrassment now, I look back on that and I just think to myself, gosh, I was just so gullible. Like, never once did I question it. Um, but I was saying to Michelle, it's interesting because I think your environment does change stuff. You know, I was surrounded by, I was in New York at the time, and I was surrounded by people who very much bought into the narrative. I was working in a corporate world at a global investment bank. So like their whole focus was like, everybody's got to be kept safe. You know, here's all the rules. I mean, I remember at one point they were issuing us with these letters saying that we had a right to come into the office for some urgent reason because you weren't allowed to enter Manhattan unless you had a letter from your employer saying you were needed. And these letters went out to the entire company and everybody in it. And everybody started panicking because they're like, I'm not coming back to the office. I might die. And they had to issue a second thing saying, sorry, we're not asking you to come back. We're just saying in the event you have to, here's the letter you present at, I don't know, the tunnel or bridge that you're crossing to enter Manhattan in order to justify your thing. I mean, we were just completely buying into that kind of thing. And I didn't really hear any dissenting voices at all in those first few months. And I actually was on X at the time, and I thought I was being really clever because I was following Nassim Taleb, who I was like, well, the guy's like, you know, hedge fund mathematician, you know, wrote Black Swan. My God, if he doesn't know statistics and doesn't understand numbers, nobody does. And then another guy in New Hampshire who's a mathematician called Joe Normani, who is a homesteader. And they were sort of having discussions the whole time on Twitter about the, you know, the curve and like flatten the curve and all that kind of stuff. And so I was just buying into this wholesale. Now I realize poor Nassim Taleb was having an absolute meltdown psychologically, you know, and was photographing himself on airplanes with like goggles and three masks on. You know, and you kind of realize that even these people that you consider to be smart, intelligent, you know, have done great things in life. I mean, they can really get just swept away. So I've had a lot of self-reflection about critical thinking and about trying to understand, like, you know, I feel like I'm my own worst enemy in the sense that I'm gullible, you know, and I need to work on that because I totally believed that what I was being told was true. And it never occurred to me that my government would try and kill me. So,
Thank goodness those days are over though, and there's nothing that we believe now that's wrong, right?
well, I mean, this
Wow.
is the thing, right? It's
Yeah,
like,
that is a thing.
Yeah, I mean, even Bitcoin. I mean, I'm a big fan of Bitcoin, but people talk a lot about that NSA paper that came out a few decades before about digital currency, and it's basically a paper about Bitcoin. And then the counter argument is, well, yeah, but doesn't mean that it's not great. The NSA invented like the internet as well, or DARPA, I think it was. DARPA invented the internet. You could go down the list of any number of things. Um, but I did chat to a friend about this once, and I said, I mean, like, I'm not a coder. I've never downloaded the code and read it all and checked it. Like, I haven't I mean, I trust that other people I trust have. Is that enough? I don't know.
Uh, I don't know. One thing I really want to bring up here is there was a 4.5 hour, I think, X space on January 8th, 2023. And Efrat Fenningson did a wonderful, she did a X thread about it. I can send you the link to it. It is fantastic. It's like 40 tweets with a bunch of clips and everything. But it was kind of a who's who of people as of that date. Pierre Corey and Steve Kirsch, and just a long list of people, and they're each talking for a few minutes. And I listened to the whole thing. It's just fascinating hearing what they were thinking on that date. Most of them had, probably all of them had completely woken up by then. But I hope that never disappears, because that is incredibly valuable. I have the transcript. I was just reading the transcript just now, because yeah, it was just great to hear what those people were thinking. And so many of them said, I bought into it for the first couple months or whatever. Again, they were trusting. They were trusting just like us. Pierre Corey in particular said he was reading the New York Times and he thought everybody had, it's fact checked. It's the paper, a record. It must be the truth. And then he completely flipped during COVID. And I think so many other people followed that same path.
Yeah, because I think reality started to not match what we were seeing. I mean, I remember
Yep.
a friend of mine in New York who I don't actually really know what her position is now on that whole thing. I think she's woken up somewhat. But I remember her repeating many times saying, she stayed in her apartment for 3 months. She literally did not set foot outside the building. So, and her husband was stuck in another country. So she was in an apartment on her own. She would only go down to reception to pick up her groceries and her thing, never set foot outside, 3 months.
Wow.
Um, and she said that she said, "Oh, I saw the morgue trucks parked outside my house. We so." And I remember thinking about this a lot afterwards, and I thought, you saw the morgue trucks, but did you see any corpses?
Right.
You know, and I just thought, yeah, like the misdirection is so easy if you don't realize it's happening. I put this thing here, it looks like, and you're like, oh yeah, it must be this, but you didn't actually see the dead bodies.
So they're going to try this again, but it's going to be a lot harder to fool us all the second time around, don't you think? I mean, I guess they already have tried it again with Mpox, but I think people are going to actually need to see the dead bodies this time.
I'm sure they can arrange that. I think they would, but it is interesting. I mean, I think I feel a bit more blessed now that I think I have a community around me, like especially in the Bitcoin space, that's a lot more skeptical and is very much about don't trust, verify. So there's that. I think I'm less surrounded by people that really buy into this stuff. But I agree. I mean, I actually think that, if I'm honest, when I look back on history now, I mean, people often say, "Oh God, there's so much misinformation these days on the internet," and I'm like, 100%. But what you don't realize is that back in the 1950s, there was just as much misinformation. In fact, it was probably all misinformation, but you had no alternative counter argument that was accessible to you. There were like five TV channels, a handful of newspapers. It was very easy to control the narrative, either overtly or covertly. So you had no idea, like, if what you believed was true. And people sort of say, oh, society was much more cohesive. Sure, because we were all sheep just herded along going, yep, this is true. Like it said so in the New York Times, the paper of record, and now there's a lot more debate because people are like, well, hang on a minute. I've got a friend who lives out in wherever they're saying, who says that that's not true. And actually what's happening on the news is not true. So I don't know. I mean, I think the narrative is much harder to control, but I think that this desire to mislead is never going to stop. Like
Right.
I think at this point, now that we hopefully a sufficiently large number of us have woken up, the mission is almost just keeping people awake and saying, look, just don't relax and think that because now things seem nicer for whatever reason that we're not being lied to about a million things. So just keep verifying everything and fact checking.
You mentioned elsewhere that Noam Chomsky himself was an amazing example, right? You know way more than I do about him, but he was all about they're lying to us, don't believe their lies before COVID, right?
I mean, he wrote a whole book about it. I think it was back in the 80s or something like that. I mean, he literally wrote a book. It was called, what is name? I've turned my phone off actually, but it's what's his book called again? Oh my God, it slipped my mind. But it was basically a whole book about like the propaganda and the media. And there's interviews with him online, which I'm sure will now get scrubbed. But you know, where he was sort of talking to people and saying, they were saying, well, what do you mean? Are you like he talked to a journalist and the journalist would say, what do you mean? You think I'm lying? I'm making stuff up when I'm doing it? And he said, no, I don't think that you're lying. But he said, I know that you wouldn't have the job at the media outlet that you have if you didn't believe in a certain narrative and have a certain viewpoint. So you have been selected specifically for your belief system to work as a journalist for this organization. And then in rolls COVID and Noam Chomsky's in his basement for like years. Yeah, I mean,
Oh,
it was crazy to think that he manufacturing consent. That's the book.
okay.
Yeah,
So,
and it's basically about how like all of these things, like the war in Ukraine, another example. You know, do you remember like in was it January, February 2022? There was just like a hard pivot from COVID in all the newspapers to all of a sudden
yeah.
Russia's invading Ukraine, Slavo Ukraini, you know, it's like we must save the thing. And I just looked at this and I was getting really annoyed with everyone. I'm like, are you guys serious? Have you missed the last 2 years? Like, are we really going to do this again? Like, absolutely not, you know. And yet people were buying into it. Ukrainian flags everywhere.
Do you think there's any hope for people who are still Branch Covidians right now? Or I wonder what percent of people have taken 10 shots? I think it can't be many, can it?
I'm gonna say something very politically incorrect, but I'm gonna say that they are self-selectively killing themselves off.
No.
So
Mm.
yes, I don't think there's any hope for people that are still buying into it. But you know, if I'm really candid about it, I don't think they're going to be around for much longer because if you're still injecting that stuff into yourself, like God help you. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, I mean, I think they're kind of self-selectively dying off in you know in much the same way that I mean, again, not to disparage people who are gay because I think you know that I have no issue with people's sexual preferences, but if you are selectively not breeding, you know, as a segment of society, at some point you are not going to be like your genes are not going to you know, they're not going to carry on. They're not going to go into perpetuity, right? Because you're selectively not breeding. So
Right.
you just end up dying out as a segment of society, and I think that's kind of inevitable. So I think it's the same thing with people who are still buying into this stuff, you know.
Okay.
Unfortunate but true, I think.
I
I
think
don't
you're
know,
right.
it'd be interesting. There's Gert Vanderbosch, who's the guy that used to work on, slightly makes
Mhm.
me concerned about his perspective, but he was a scientist for Bill Gates, for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But he said he thinks that about 25% of the population will be dead in the next 2, 3 years who took the shots.
Yeah, I've heard him say that. Yeah.
Mm. Which I don't know if
Okay.
that's true. I definitely saw in the first couple of years after the shots, there was a huge wave of people getting sick and dying. Like I knew suddenly about 40 people, either directly or indirectly, like a parent of a friend or something who got cancer just out of the blue. I think about 10 of them have died now. So one was a friend of mine from many years ago. Another one was my mum's friend, good friend from her school years, several people who are my parents' neighbors, you know, so there's been definitely a wave of people dying, but I have a suspicion that maybe the people that were very weak from an immune standpoint have kind of, you know, passed away now. And the rest of them are probably going to hang on for a bit longer. I mean, 25% seems very high to me, but who knows, right?
Yeah. So my social circle is not that big, but since the shots rolled out, the toll in terms of strokes and cancer and death has been huge. Yeah, there's no way it's a coincidence. Just around the people that I know, family and friends, it's been terrible. Yeah. And I'm hearing this
Yeah.
from a lot of other people. They're saying, yeah, kind of similar to my experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure that'll get memory hold and scrubbed. But I think part of the issue is like, particularly if you've given those shots to your children, um, you know, I just think the cognitive load of having to accept what's happened, I think is probably too huge for some people. I think they would rather live in denial. I think it's just too difficult for them, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sad thing, but it does make it difficult to wake people up. So I just think, you know, I try and be as honest as I can with people and tell them what my position is. And I find actually that far more people agree than you would think. They're just not comfortable saying it publicly because I think people will go after them. But I think it really behooves us to be as honest as we can about what we see happening, because I think that's the only way that you really give other people permission to speak up as well.
I totally agree. I hate to say it, but I do need to wrap up myself here pretty soon.
I
Hate
know.
to end on a bummer note, but
Well, I think I tell you what note we should land on, because I know you've obviously spent many, many years going down this climate rabbit hole. Could you give some advice to people who would like to wake other people up, or who would like to do their own research, who would like to understand this better? Like, where would you direct them? And what do you think is the best way to kind of spread the message of truth and facts?
okay, I would direct them to climatethemovie.net to watch the movie, and also to my Twitter, my X feed, Tom A. Nelson. But yeah, Tony Climate is another good place to go. There's a great website from Anthony Watts called What's Up With That, WATTS, fabulous. Another place is called Climate Depot. There's a lot of places out there. But for people who are fighting back, I would say just be that guy or that gal who, when people are in at parties and stuff are saying we're all going to die, isn't it terrible? Push back and speak up. It's so important because they want to use this for so many terrible purposes. We didn't talk about CBDC and 15-minute cities, and they want to do all these horrible things to us using this as an excuse. So I think it's important for all of us to fight back hard against it.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, thank you so much, Tom. You've dedicated a ton of time and of your life to this. What's your next project on the horizon, or are you going to carry on with this work?
We are. I was just talking to Martin Durkin today. We're working on a follow up to Climate the Movie, and it's going to be a number of shorts, maybe a lot of short, maybe 10 seconds to 10 minutes. Yeah, looking at kind of ripping this apart in every different way. So that'll be coming out. First one should come out in the next month or two.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been so nice to chat to you, and
Uh,
thank you for connecting at the conference. And I hope to see you again.
yeah, great. Thank you, Krista. And yeah, this is super fun talking. Well, let's do it again. Bye.
All right, take care. Bye bye.
Yep. Right.